They go from the poll. What does the poll tell us about you? And I'm going to comment on the audience poll, and then I'll say, let's jump into the index. Okay. You tell me when. No problem.
One time I was at an event, very similar scenario. They wanted us to be quiet. You know, we've got a couple of minutes, and they kept extending it. And the facilitator got everybody going, got them in a good mood, started singing Sweet Caroline. By the end of 2 minutes, everyone was singing Sweet Caroline. I'm not suggesting that. No. Let's pick a different song. No.
I'll give you the mic.
Nobody,
Wouldn't you want it anymore?
nobody wants me to sing, I promise you that.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to welcome our in-person and virtual audience. Today, we're here to talk about prosperity. Throughout our session, we will be polling your opinion and accepting questions at the end of the session, just to get you teed up for that. My name is Farah Pandith, and I'm part of the thought leadership team at the Milken Center for Advancing the American Dream. It is a new organization that is illuminating pathways toward the American dream through an experiential center at the heart of Washington, D.C. I would really like to thank the United Way Worldwide for hosting us in this beautiful, beautiful facility. Our center is under construction, so in the future we'll host events like this, but we're not there yet. And to prove that I am not lying, we have a video to show you where we are today. If we can look at the screen here.
We are at the corner of 15th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue, directly across from the Treasury and catty corner to the White House. The campus is really comprised of 5 buildings, 3 historic bank buildings facing out onto Pennsylvania Avenue, and 2 office towers or mixed-use buildings that sit along 15th Street, about 300,000 square feet in total. One of the major things we're doing is connecting all 5 of those buildings in order for us to have all the spaces that we need to achieve the mission. These buildings, they're all in the National Historic Register. So doing all of this work underground had to be very delicate. All these buildings were held up in the air for about a year as we dug down, created new foundations to support the buildings while creating amazing program space to help the center achieve its mission of really discussing and celebrating the American dream. With a 250-seat theater, a large immersive gallery where we can do highly technological exhibits, as well as a number of other spaces underneath all these buildings. And you would never have known it from the street for the 2 years we've been doing this work because we couldn't see a thing. We call the atrium space our 6th building. It's positioned right in the center of the other 5 and really becomes a place to connect all of them together in a multi-story space. It's 5 stories tall. It's being conceived of as an outdoor garden. It'll be where our visitors can come and reflect, pause, and think about the experience they just had. We'll be able to open up a public restaurant on one of the upper levels of one of those buildings with amazing views out over the city, the White House, the Treasury, the Mall, the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial. All of that laid out for people so that when they can come to the center and learn about the American dream, and they can also go up and see all these institutions that are foundational to that dream. Both in the spaces that are already finished and the ones to come, is a reflection and a respect of the tradition and history of these buildings. We've tried to maintain a real connection to the very important history of what happened in these buildings. In our main lobby, there's a beautifully restored lobby with rich marble, all of these original brass detailed components from the original building. And right alongside of it is the high technology where we can do a whole range of things to help talk about what we do and how we do it. So there's that theme of the old and the new. It's reflected in the architecture, but it's really a reflection of our mission as a whole. We're about the now, we're about the future. So you'll see reflected in that technology being used right alongside the historic finishes. I'm excited to be able to bring people in and really begin to help them see what the possibilities are going to be here to be able to share all that we have to share about our mission.
So that is our organization. It's located, as you saw, right across from the White House. It excites me every time I see that video. We're going to be excited to welcome you to our facilities when it's open. I joined the Milken Center for Advancing the American Dream a couple of years ago, after about 20 years in public service. And one of the reasons I did that is because I deeply believe in the mission of making sure that we illuminate the American dream narratives for a diverse group of Americans across our country. As Dave Grissino, my colleague in the video, talked about, this is about the future. It's about power and the prosperity of what's to come. So today's conversation about prosperity is a welcome one. And I'm so delighted all of you are here in person. I'm really thankful to the audience that is online. But as we gather here in Alexandria, Virginia, our country continues to navigate the lasting impacts of the pandemic and the economic realities of rising inflation and a shrinking economy. And as we look ahead, global conflict and instability seem likely to intensify threats to prosperity here at home. So how are we weathering the storm? And how can the institutions help those who are struggling to find prosperity? A deeper and more nuanced understanding of prosperity is crucial to a thriving and inclusive future. To answer these questions and more, we partnered with the Legatum Institute to launch the 2020 American Dream Prosperity Index. Later this month, we will publicly launch the index, and we're happy to have you, the impact and also industry experts here in the room and online with us today to talk about this, and delighted to have the panel that we have gathered today. I would like to learn more from all of you about where you're from and why you're here, and we'll get to that in the course of this morning. But I want to just draw your attention to the fact that we're going to be doing some polls. I'm going to make you do some work. So participating in our polls is going to be very easy. You can open up the camera app on your smartphone and scan the QR code, or you can click the link in the chat. Let's get started. The first question we're going to ask is a really basic one. Where are you joining us from? And one word to describe what the American dream means to you. So if you can participate in that, I'm sorry to the panelists, you can't do that. So I'm going to take the floor for a second and just tell you what my one word is, which is freedom. For me, as I came to this country as a baby and grew up outside of Boston, Massachusetts, what we stand for here in the United States around freedom is really central to who I am. So I'm interested to see what we have here. We have Princeton, New Jersey, Tampa, Florida, Virginia. Where else do we have? New York. Oh, wow. Arizona. Excellent. Where else do we have? Baton Rouge. London, of course, we have an international audience. I love that. Baltimore. So we have nice diversity of locations. See how we move into the numbers. Okay, there we go. So one word to describe the American dream. Listen, it's amazing, actually. Okay, so it's moving. Opportunity and freedom obviously are up there too. But it gives us a sense of who we are gathered in this room and what's important to us. I really appreciate you participating in the poll. This is your first poll. There are more to come, so be prepared. We have the ability also to take questions, and at the end of, as I said, our session, we'll have a chance for you to ask questions. And as we get started, you can be thinking about them too. So I'd like to move into a conversation about the index itself. We've learned at the Milken Center for Advancing the American Dream that each individual defines the American dream in a unique way. And we believe that no matter your definition, the American dream is more attainable through 4 pillars. And the pillars that we are constructing our frame around are public health and medical research, education and the educator, access to capital and financial empowerment, and entrepreneurship and innovation. Each of these pillars highlights an area that is essential for social and economic prosperity across the country. And the American Dream Prosperity Index helps us to understand the complexity of local challenges and how they relate to each other. For example, we can assess the correlation between health and crime or education and business. Our center is built on a principle that better data leads to better decision-making. And I'm sure that many who are nodding their heads agree with me too. I want to open up to my fellow panelists and understand the data that they are thinking about. And so I'm putting them on the spot with an odd question, but it's a fun one. In a 1-minute response, I'd love for you to tell me one number, one figure, or one data point that's influencing how you do what you do. For example, my number is 0.0138%. That's a weird number, but I've spent most of my life in public service working on fighting hate and extremism. And that number represents the number of the dollars that the US government has spent on soft power to fight ISIS, 0.0138%. So for me, that's a really powerful number. But I'm interested in your numbers. So Rosie, I'm going to ask you to go first.
Well, thank you so much, Farah. And thank you to all of our audience that's here with us in the room, but those that may be with us virtually as well. I'm Rosie Allen Herring from the United Way of the National Capital Area. The number for me, Farah, is 500,000 households here in the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia. We call it the DMV. They are part of what we call our ALICE population. And my colleague, Scott Bengier, who is our data guy, is here as well. And when we say ALICE population, it's an acronym that stands for asset limited, income constrained, but employed. And if 500,000 households are in that category, these are individuals who are going to work every single day, doing the best that they can, but they still can't make ends meet and meet their essential needs. So when I think about 500,000 families, that of course exponentially is more in terms of numbers, that's just the number of families. And if there are 3 in a family, 4 in a family, 10 in a family, it's exponentially that much more. And if I can give you just one more little snippet, 26% of the total households in this area make decisions about how they're going to truly make ends meet. It's a tough decision. Do I pay my rent? Or do I buy my food and the like? And so to know that 26% in an environment that is so seen as very affluent in this area, where we have high income, high education, we are seen as a fit region as well, but we have on the other side of that gap a lot of work that we have to do.
It's really powerful. Thank you, Rosie. Alex, I'll turn to you.
Thank you, Farah, and it's wonderful to be here. I'm grateful to be here in front of you. I'm Dr. Alex Alonso, and I represent the Society for Human Resource Management, or SHRM, if you've seen our commercials. SHRM represents close to 1.5 million HR professionals across the US, and they have an impact on close to 115 million workers. But your question was, give me a stat that actually guides your work. And here's the stat I'm going to give you. 64. 64% of Americans cannot survive more than 4 weeks without pay. 64% of working Americans cannot survive more than 4 weeks without pay. Take that into account, and then also take into account the notions of the Great Resignation, where 38 million Americans left their current job with the hopes of better opportunity. All they were looking for was better opportunity. Our data even suggests that close to 58% of those working Americans were really interested in more flexibility, not the flexibility we hear about when we hear about remote work or a different place to work or better work-life balance. They wanted flexibility to actually achieve their dream. And they wanted that from their employers. So our work as an association of employers close to 1.5 million employers, is really to help HR professionals and the world of work do what they can to help Americans achieve that dream.
That's really excellent. Thank you very much. Teal, welcome. And I know you're online. This is our other panelist, and I would love for you to give us your number.
Yeah, thank you. My number is 56, and this is a pretty simple number, but it represents the 56 counties that we have in our state. As a statewide community foundation, we're really committed to supporting those counties that, house about just over 1 million Montanans. And we're really focused in our work on helping those communities flourish and supporting, impactful and inclusive philanthropy that is reaching every corner of our state in all 56 of those counties, working with partners in those counties. And, that's really a big focus of the work we're doing as the statewide community foundation.
Thank you so much. Sean, welcome. And Sean is also on the screen. Could I ask for your number?
Hi, Farah and everybody. It's great to be with you today. Super excited as well with the partnership with MCAT. So my number today is 49. When we look at what is prosperity and how that all of those things that go towards building a truly flourishing life, there are 49, we believe, individual components within the US. And I will unpack those a little bit later, but it's all those 49 aspects that lead to a truly flourishing life.
So much. And I know that there were a lot of indicators, over 200, and you had 80 separate trust sources. So to pick a number was very hard. So I look forward to hearing more, Sean. Fred, what's your number?
So it's hard for me to figure out one number because I know a lot of numbers.
I think your mic is not on. Yep. No worries.
Oh, okay. What about now?
You okay? All right, well, there we go.
There we go. So it's hard for me to come up with one number, but I think I've rounded down to 60%. 60%, almost 60% of Americans right now say they have no trust in elected officials or institutions here in the US. And almost 60% of young people say they don't trust each other or the people around them. And that if given the opportunity that folks will take advantage of them, right? Trust. They don't trust. Trust is at the core of all of our social ills. It is at the core of our economy, our democracy. It is at the core of healthy living and also in a myriad of things that are happening right now in our country. Crime, which is they talk about in the index. And so if we're really going to solve and create an American dream for everybody, you can't do it in a silo or in a corner by yourself. The American dream is only available when everything works together in tandem. And so right now, I'm deeply, deeply hardened by the numbers of 60%, but there's a way out of this. And we just have to do some things differently in this country if we're going to create a more trusting country where people will tap into the systems, but also tap into each other. Trust.
Thank you so much. Obviously, you can hear our panelists are all involved in different kinds of work, but we're all carving pathways to some kind of prosperity. And data can guide all of us in our work. I'd like to hear from the audience again. We have another poll for you. If you could kindly take the poll. The question is, which factor do you consider most important when it comes to your own prosperity? There's a multiple choice: income, home ownership, social networks, safety, health, freedom, or something else. While you answer, it's important to remember that each of us has a unique starting point. So we think of prosperity differently. For example, as I mentioned to you, freedom is very important to me, but so is health and safety. So what does it say here? Oh my goodness. Wow. Okay. So income at 49%. Why does that keep going back and forth? Okay. Somewhere in the 40s%. Freedom, health, social networks, and home ownership is only at 2%, which I think is a really powerful feature of this poll. It's there we go. Yeah, after COVID, health is moving up. Okay, so we see the diversity of thought here, and some income is important as well. But I want to take a look at your polling compared to what we have actually seen in the index. So I'd like to jump to unveil some of the key findings. And Sean, I'd like to welcome you back. And could you kindly tell us a little bit, first of all, about Legatum and what it does?
Yeah, very happy to do that, Farah. So the Legatum Institute is a London-based think tank, but very much with a global mission. And our mission is quite simple, is to create a movement of people who are committed to creating the pathways from poverty to prosperity, and through that, the transformation of society. And when our founders originally started the Institute about 15 years ago in 2007, they really had a heart for helping nations move on this journey. But they realized that actually it's difficult to move from where you are unless you know where you are. So the idea of the Global Prosperity Index was born. And we've been measuring prosperity across 167 nations around the world, including the United States, covering over 99% of the world's population for the past 15 years. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of a flavor of who we are and what we do.
Sean,
But the next thing is really around prosperity is one of those terms which is interchangeable, means different things to different people. Some people mean it just refers to financial or economic wealth, but we at Legatum believe that it's much more holistic than that, and it's a combination of economic, institutional, and social well-being. Again, that's quite a mouthful. So we've created this short video, which we're going to play now. Hopefully this will unpack that in a bit more detail.
Prosperity is much more than mere wealth or economic growth. True prosperity is when all people have the opportunity to thrive. In a prosperous society, people live in peace, free from the threat of violence, oppression, and crime. Everyone's inherent dignity is respected, and all are free to vote, to protest, and to follow their beliefs. Governing institutions in every sector act with truth and integrity and are subject to the rule of law. And there are stable families and supportive communities that instill the values that shape the culture and build the bonds of trust needed for society to flourish. Prosperity is driven by an open economy that harnesses ideas and talent to foster employment and productivity, and create sustainable pathways out of poverty. In a prosperous nation, open markets and high-quality infrastructure facilitate trade and commerce. There is a strong investment environment and effective business regulation that enables entrepreneurship, competition, and innovation. And people have the opportunity to work, to earn, to save, to take risk, and to succeed. Prosperity is built by empowered people who choose to live in right relationship with one another and create a society in which everybody is able to build a life free from poverty. People take care of their physical and mental well-being and can rely on a healthcare system that will take care of them when they need it. Learning is valued, and everyone receives a high-quality education so they can write their own futures. And the natural environment is stewarded wisely as a legacy for present and future generations. Prosperity means everyone has the opportunity and freedom to fulfill their unique potential and take responsibility for contributing to their communities and nations. Because ultimately, prosperity is not just what we have on the outside. It is also about who we become on the inside. True prosperity is a life well lived.
Sean, and it's very powerful. I wish every American that video, actually. Sean, I'm wondering how you get from the concepts in the video to the index. Can you explain to us how you did that?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we have done, as I mentioned, is that we've taken that broad concept and we've broken it down into the individual components. I've been doing that for 15 years. And then in 2019, we worked with a number of experts in the US from think tanks, research institutions, academia, to come up with a sort of prosperity definition, if you like, for the United States. And what we landed on was this slide. I'm going to shut this slide up, which hopefully you can see. For those on, it may be a little bit small for those on screen, but I'll go through this very briefly. And you'll see parallels with this through the video. So there are three broad domains: inclusive societies, open economies, and empowered people. And I'll just talk them through quickly. So inclusive societies is everything that needed to create a strong and inclusive society. So here we're looking at safety and security, that society needs to be free from crime, but also that people have high levels of personal freedom, have agency, are free to move, free to associate, free to speak, that they are governed well by the institutions, that there's strong political accountability, rule of law, and government acts with integrity. And then the final pillar is social capital, which really measures the strengths of relationships in society. So those relationships closest to us, family and friends, but then widening out to neighbours, institutional trust, including government, and then finally the extent to which people engage and participate in society. And then the second domain is open economies. And this is everything that's needed to create a strong, vibrant, open and inclusive economy. So here we're looking at the business environment, that there's access to finance, that the markets are open to new participants coming in, and that regulation supports rather than hinders business. We also have strong infrastructure, so digital communication, but also electricity and water, and a strong transport system. And then economic quality really is the engine of the open economies domain. So this is looking at the strength of the economy through productivity and competitiveness, through dynamism, what we were talking about earlier, entrepreneurship and rate of startups. And then the final domain is the empowered people domain. Here we're looking at the lived experience of people. So what are their living conditions like? Do they have access to financial resources, good quality shelter and accommodation? The health of the nation. Here we're looking at things like behavioral risk factors, things that unchecked can lead to serious health problems later in life. But also, are people taking care of their health through preventative interventions, regularly visiting the dentist and doctors? We look at the quality and affordability of care systems, the mental and physical health of the population. Education then tracks the different stages of education, access to quality of and the extent to which people complete. And then finally, the natural environment is all of those elements around us which are important to our society. What's their quality and how much are they being preserved for current and future generations? So you have these three domains, these 11 pillars, and these 49 elements that I referred to earlier. And each of these elements are underpinned by a basket of between 4 and 8 indicators to really try and capture that particular aspect of prosperity. So what we end up with when we take all this into account is an index of the 50 states and Washington, DC, but also across nearly 1,500 counties in 17 selected states. And they're highlighted by the blue states on the map. The dark blue ones are actually the counties that we're adding this year into this year's index. And our trajectory of travel really is to try and include all 3,140 counties within the index over time. So Farah, hopefully that gives a little bit of a flavor of the index, and back to you.
And then it's actually unbelievably interesting to look at how you've combined different things that we talk about in our daily lives into this idea of what prosperity is. But I'm curious, because you've been doing this for some time. What strikes you as really different this year?
Yeah, I think there's a number of key findings that we've pulled together from this year's index. Obviously, it's a very comprehensive index. There's over, I think, 4.5 million data points across all the different aspects. But there are 5 key findings that I'll just quickly unpack. So I'll just share my screen again. So the first key finding really was around following the pandemic. What we found last year in 2021 when we published the index is, not surprisingly, that across all the US states, when you added them together, we found that prosperity diminished in 2021 as a result of the pandemic. So we were keen to see what the impact was in 2022. And it is quite encouraging to see that over half the states have recovered to pre-pandemic levels of prosperity. So that is the first encouraging sign. But obviously, as was already alluded to earlier, the inflation that's the US and many other parts of the world are currently experiencing does potentially threaten further progress. We also see that there is obviously some long-term effects of COVID still to be worked through. So for example, from health, when we look at the impact of long COVID, for example, that has affected states in different ways. So if we look at Delaware, it's estimated that around 9% of the population are struggling with the effects of long COVID. But when you go to Mississippi, it stands at 21%, which is 1 in 5 people. We also see that the impact that COVID had on education has also been significant. And that is going to obviously take a while to work through the system. Obviously, there's funding being made available to try and catch up, but it obviously had a big impact. But we also see 2 quarters of negative growth, and we see high inflation. So these are obviously concerning signs. But some of the encouraging signs that we also see is actually the number of new business applications, which in the second half of the pandemic, we saw a big increase. And pretty much month on month, we've seen a high number of new business applications, although I do believe the latest month has shown a slight downtick, so we'll have to watch that. But we also see that there's been a record number of jobs. So there are many indicators in the economy which are pointing to a more positive story. But obviously, this is still of concern, not just to the US, but many other parts of the world. So that's the first key finding. The second key finding then really is when we look at the longer term, prosperity has been rising post the financial crisis. And we see that all states, apart from North Dakota, have actually seen an increase in prosperity since 2012. But what we also see is that prosperity is not universally shared or not shared equally, both across the individual states, but also through the county index, we can then look at how prosperity is distributed within states. And here, for example, we see California, and we see quite a different picture. We see that a number of the counties, obviously, as you'd expect, perhaps around the Bay Area, are in the top quintile of all 1,500 counties in the index, but you have a big distribution and you see some counties are also in the 5th quintile. What we also see when we look at prosperity, actually, we can look at using the county index, we can apply that to other classifications. So we're able to classify those counties that are urban and those that are rural. And it probably isn't a surprise that when you do that, we find that overall urban counties outperform rural, but that's not universally the case. And in the report, we talk about some exceptions, but generally speaking, urban areas outperform rural areas. However, what we also see is when we can apply population demographics to that. And this is a fairly simple, crude analysis, but it gives some sort of sense. We're able to combine the scores of the index with population demographics. We also see some interesting pictures coming through, which we talk about a bit in the report. So when we apply urban rural and then apply the different population demographics, so if we look at white Americans and Black Americans, we see that actually across urban and rural areas, we see quite a lot of similarity between white Americans living in urban areas, Black Americans in urban areas, and white Americans in rural areas, generally living in areas that are more prosperous. But we find that sort of Black Americans living in rural areas, generally those areas are less prosperous. Again, this is quite simple and requires further unpicking and interrogation, but it's an interesting starting point. The third key finding really that we highlight in this year's report is around the high and rising gun crime. So what we find here is through the county level index, we can look at the percentage of counties that have experienced a death or mass shooting or an injury from a mass shooting event. And back in 2014, we found that roughly just under 10% of the 1,500 counties had experienced some type of event. But roll forward to 2021, we see that that's nearly stands at 20%. So almost a doubling. So these events have not only become more frequent, but also more widespread. And just another sort of statistic here, or just looking at some other data, we can also see that the number of, or the estimated number of guns sold in the US has been trending steadily upwards, but hit a big spike during the pandemic. And this has obviously potentially had an impact, or somehow explains or perhaps provides a bit of context to what's going on. But when we look at the impact of this within the index, we see the safety and security. Remember, that's one of the pillars within inclusive societies. We break that down into a number of different elements, we can see the top dotted line and a decreasing score indicates that things are getting weaker. We see that mass killings and injuries have been declining since around 2014. But there are some encouraging statistics around crime as well. We see that property crime, for example, that's the dotted line at the bottom of the chart, has actually been trending upwards in terms of the score, which means that things have been getting better. Burglaries, car theft, etc., have been reducing. So there's a bit of a mixed picture within crime. But what we also find is that these type of events are impacting on society's sense of their security. So this data is from a study done by Gallup, which looked at the number of parents, or the percentage of parents who 44% say they fear for their oldest child's personal safety at school. It represents a 21-year high and is 3 times that what it was in 2008. We also see that this is not just related to parents, but also children themselves. 20% said that they were concerned about returning to school in the fall of 2022 due to safety, which has doubled previous rates. Now, obviously, it's really important to bear in mind here that they don't tease out the factors why. And COVID could obviously be one factor why people are feeling less safe about returning to school. So another key finding, the fourth key finding, was really around mental health within the health pillar. We see, as this chart shows, the trending upwards of the number of drug overdose deaths in recent years, but then we hit the pandemic and we see that actually that spiked even further. So there are 107,000 deaths in the 12 months to December 2021, and that's 50% higher than 2 years previously. But we don't just see this coming through on drug overdose deaths, we also see it in self-reported mental health, where people say they report their mental health as being poor. The serious mental illness cases as well have also been rising and trending upwards. So what we see within the index when we look at this is we see that the mental health element has weakened over the past decade. But as within safety and security, we also see some positive news within the health pillar, and it's important to recognize this as well. So we look at smoking rates, excessive alcohol use, and pain reliever misuse have all fallen over the past decade. We also see that actually during that time, cost and access to healthcare has also improved. So when we look at the other health elements within the health pillar and combine those, we see that the score is going up, indicating that things have actually got better. So the final key finding I just want to highlight really is around, and Alex was talking a bit about this, around social cohesion. We see that through the index, a weakening of this, and this builds upon work obviously done by the likes of Robert Putnam in Bowling Alone. But we see a number of concerning factors coming through. So Alex cited some statistics, but we've, if you hear that 2 in 3 Americans reported not being friends with their neighbors just before the pandemic. And also that 65% of Americans say that most political candidates run for office to serve their own personal interest. And then that feeding into that trust element that Alex was talking about. So what we see when we look at social networks, which is one of the elements within the social capital pillar, we see that this has weakened over the past decade. Now, this can represent, or this can come across as fairly depressing news. But I think one of the encouraging things that we found was that actually some work or research done by an organization called More in Common, which actually did some cluster analysis by doing a survey and then categorizing each respondent according to how they answered certain questions. They had this group called the exhausted majority, and 2/3 of Americans fall into this category, and they believe that common ground is possible. They're slightly tired of the existing sort of backdrop. And so I think that's quite encouraging. That is the sort of potential for a movement there to begin to see change. And just sort of feeding into this, in the book, Depths of Despair by Case and Deaton, they talk about some of the outworkings of this decline, perhaps explaining some of the things that I've just talked through. So around the rise in drug overdose deaths and things, because they've become opioids or the opium of the masses. And flipping that around, Arthur Brooks in his book In Strength to Strength talks about this idea that family, faith and friendship and work that serves being the key contingent factors which determine someone's happiness. And this idea that work that serves, I think, is also worthy of further exploration. I think perhaps in America and also in other parts of the world, including the UK, this idea of work has become as Robert Bellah talks about in his book, Habits of the Heart, this idea of sort of excessive individualism, and how do we turn that around to actually seeing work as something that serves other people. And this idea of sort of serving and belonging was picked up by the Harvard Business Review in a study that they did. And this idea of high belonging was linked to a whopping increase, their words, a whopping 50% increase in performance. But they also talk about how this led to fewer sick days and generally a sort of sense of personal, better personal experience in the working environment. So they're the 5 key findings, but I just wanted to land on one slide, Barbara, before I hand back, which is, the American Dream Index, Prosperity Index is much richer and broader. We've pulled out some themes here, which majoritarily cover most states and counties and are challenges, as well as some positives that I've talked about, property crime and certain aspects of health. But there's much opportunity to interrogate, understand each area, what are their strengths and weaknesses at a state and county level, so that you can build a greater prosperity for all Americans. Back to you, Farah.
Sean, and we're going to unpack some of those key findings with our panelists. And I'd like to welcome Teal to begin the conversation. Teal, community foundations like yours bring together the financial resources of individuals, families, and businesses to support effective nonprofits and in their communities. You have used the index of previous years, and it would be great for the audience to hear from a fellow practitioner on how you're using the index to affect change. How has the index helped to inform you in your work and more broadly within Montana?
Yes, thank you. The index has really served as an informational tool for us, data that we can refer to when looking at, what are the needs of our state and the many communities that are within our state. And one thing that we've really done is we have about 45 local community foundation affiliates across Montana that are more at the local level. And really where we've focused our efforts with the index is, we invited Sean to present in front of some of our affiliates last year to not only show this data and get these communities thinking about what this looks like, what prosperity looks like across our state, but also to understand how they could utilize this data. So I think we're still kind of in the initial steps of really figuring out the best way to utilize this data, but it's a starting point for us to look at what's happening across the state. And we're looking forward to this coming spring, bringing our local community foundations affiliates together in person to look at some of this data and delve a little deeper into what does this mean at the county level as well as the state level, to think about what prosperity looks like. And, I also had the opportunity to connect with our colleagues at Headwaters Foundation here in Montana, and they said they're doing similar things. They're really sharing this data with their grantees and helping them understand how to utilize it so that we can start really using this data to explore prosperity in Montana.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's really rare in the national conversation to hear about counties. We don't really have a lot of data on counties. What advice, what are you thinking about in terms of what leaders can be doing as they think about that county data? Are there places that are obvious places that can be helped?
Well, I think looking at county data is crucial because we know that wisdom is in the community, in the county, by looking at the local levels. For example, we know that mental health is declining all over the place, but how do we really address that in our state? Well, we look at what are some of the issues maybe happening? Where is this happening? Is some of this related to access? That's something we talk about a lot with the high suicide rate in Montana is how can people access the mental health they need? And also, I think a part of it too, when local and county leaders are really looking at this is speaking with their counties, looking at the data that's there to understand what's the greatest impact they can have. I think a part of it is allocating resources too. As a community foundation, especially statewide, this county level data allows us to see where there's gaps in funding. For example, one thing we know is that rural communities and tribal communities in Montana can sometimes be under-resourced. We saw this a lot. We've seen this a lot with disaster recovery and we've really looked at how can we ensure philanthropy and resources are being directed to these places that maybe don't see as much funding as maybe their urban counterparts. And you can see that in the prosperity data. Bighorn County is listed as our least prosperous county. And we've got a large amount of tribal community in there. The Crow Reservation sits on there. Part of the Northern Cheyenne Reservation sits on there. And I think looking at that, we can also say, are we putting enough resources into this county to ensure that they have what they need to truly prosper? And I think by looking at this county data, by local leaders looking at this county data, enables us to just have a bigger understanding of where we can have the greatest impact.
That's actually really illuminating and powerful as we have these conversations across America to understand what you can do with the data in a real way, right? I also, we talked a little bit about social cohesion in the conversation so far, and it's a critical issue in the national landscape, and the strength of relationships and the sense of solidarity among members of community. And it's one of the key findings in the index, as you heard from Sean. So with a waning social cohesion and people less engaged and involved, I'm going to turn this to Rosie, and I'm going to ask some questions of you. Tell me, your work is obviously directly related to the grassroots. How do you interpret the social cohesion data, and what insights have you learned from this waning data?
Well, I will tell you, Sean was fascinated. I felt like I was sitting with the professor. But I will say this, for us at United Way, feeling connected to community is literally how we live united every single day. And for us, the strength lies in our collaboration. One of the things that I always say about us at United Way is we are a convener, a collaborator, and a catalyst, meaning that we bring partners together. Many of the nonprofits who are serving families on the ground every day, your United Way is serving families on the ground every day. But we also try to bring business to community and community to business, because as a collaborator, we recognize that we can do nothing by ourselves. But we also want to be catalytic, because we know when we look at the data, and we are very much data-driven, evidence-based, to ensure that we're having the impact that we have, that we seek to have with those that we seek to serve. And we have to be catalytic, meaning that we have to come up with innovative thought leadership solutions to some of the toughest challenges that are facing our communities every single day. And so when we look at those barriers and we think about social cohesion, it really is a challenge for us to ensure that we keep that connectivity. And so as I think about how we do that on a day-to-day basis on the ground, here in the Washington metropolitan area, we have 3 strategic pillars. And I'm sure that if you overlay them with your strategic pillars for your respective organizations, they're going to be something similar. I know I heard when you were talking about what you were doing at the center, I saw all 3 of our pillars in all that you were saying around education, financial stability, and health. And so when we think about the disparities, many of those disparities have always been with us. I will say over the last 2.5, 3 years, they've simply been exacerbated. They have probably come to the forefront of your mind a little bit more because it's been, quote unquote, in your face. But at the end of the day, these issues were always here. They're just bigger now. And you'll also find that they're bigger because more and more people who traditionally haven't been, quote unquote, of need find themselves in that space. And so when it comes to healthy food, when we think about our region, we have food deserts. Who knew? Because as I said at the offset, when we look at the Washington metropolitan area, it is one of the most affluent. 6 of the top 10 highest earning incomes are in this area. 9 out of the top 20 across this country are here. When you think about low unemployment, because there are big jobs that are here. When we think about sometimes if you're a chamber of commerce, this is a dream. We're one of the fittest cities, or counties or regions in the country. But when you go literally just sometimes across the street, sometimes across the community, sometimes just across the region, the gap is so large for those who can't take advantage of all of those resources that are available. If they have a literacy rate, they can't get that higher order, higher thinking, higher paying job. When you look at, we have some of the highest chronic disease rates in the country. We have food deserts that are second to only the state of Mississippi. And it's all right here in the midst of all of that largesse. So what we have to do is continue to work with partners, but we do mine the data. to ensure that we're being as effective as possible, because we live off of donations and contributions and investments from partners. We have to also ensure that we're being good stewards of what's been entrusted to us as well.
So if the social fabric isn't strong, it directly impacts what you're
Absolutely.
saying. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And Fred, obviously, in the work that you do, this is a huge issue. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about what you said earlier, and how this data impacts.
So it definitely impacts. So I don't think I introduced myself earlier. So I'm the executive director of WEAVE, the Social Fabric Project at the Aspen Institute. And our work is really centered around how do we support local community leaders around the country, empower them to go out and fix the issues that they see in their community. We do this because as a nation, and I talk about our trust being low, we've been here before. We were here after World War II when local groups were the groups that taught English to new Americans, that helped families with the grief journey, that welcomed young men back home and helped them find jobs. We were here between 1960 and 1970, where we found the birth of the nonprofit industry here in the US. These local groups helped Americans navigate some really turbulent times, and we saw some prosperous moments after that. So where we are right now is that trust is low. And if we right now were to roll a basket into neighborhoods and say, hey, this is great, this will work for everybody. And if you don't trust, nobody's going to tap into the basket, right? And so what we find is that in these neighborhoods around the country, although you hear these stats and the numbers are hard to stomach, we find these people in neighborhoods around the country who are the trust brokers, who say to the entire neighborhood, come on, trust the system, it's good. And if it doesn't work for you, I'll show you how to make it work. And so what we started doing is giving money to these small groups and helping them figure out how to make their work bigger and how to make it brighter. And what we find is you go back into these neighborhoods, you pull up on the street, we get out of our cars, and somebody is called the person who we're working with 4 or 5 times to say, who are these folks on your block? We don't know them. Tell us, help us. And so as we go into neighborhoods, we say, this is how you bring a community together. This is how you do this. This is how you do that. And what we find is that they are the best, in my opinion, the best and the brightest solution for what we have right now. If we want to fix our institutions or trust in our institutions, it's going to work by the speed of transparency, right? And results for people on the ground. If you want to fix social trust, interpersonal trust, we talk a lot about neighbors. It works at the speed of relationships. And we find the people that we work with in communities around the country are building and brokering the relationships, and you find higher trust in those communities. And so if we're going to climb out of the issues that we helped to highlight earlier, it has to center around trust, but it has to have the solutions about how you build better relationships in communities.
Do you find that the people that you are working with talk about this issue of social cohesion?
No. And they don't know why they're doing what they're doing. And so part of our work is to highlight it, to show them that they're tapping in and helping to fix a larger issue in society. That is at the core of our work, because most of the folks just say, well, I'm just feeding kids after school, but they don't recognize that the act of doing that is helping to solve a greater societal issue. They don't talk about it in that way. And I always push back on even language, right? So people in neighborhoods don't say social cohesion. They say, we don't know each other. And so how do we even correct our language so that it's consumable enough for people who live on Main Street and not just people on Wall Street?
Excellent. Thank you so much. And strong communities obviously are critical to many dimensions of the prosperous America. And the index illustrates that with the decrease in social cohesion, we need to think about how the business environment may be changing. And Alex, I'm thrilled you're here with us, and thank you so much. Can you comment on how state or county can create a dynamic business environment, considering the data that we've just heard from Sean, the changes that are happening in America today?
Well, that's a great question. And in large part, I think one of the things that gets lost is the notion of a public-private partnership. And we have yet to see it really take hold in a variety of counties, in large part because many of them are geared towards either social good programs or through a variety of other efforts, really towards meeting the needs of the employer. And one of the things that I find in particular is the most common public-private partnership is charitable. The second most common one, though, in 40% of cases is actually geared towards, I have a talent shortage and I need talent shortage. So it happens with community colleges, it happens with a variety of other groups. What is incredible though is only 2% of employers actually do community-based programs or public-private partnerships for the emphasis of social cohesion, for the emphasis of making sure that we're building community. And largely, it's no surprise. When you look at what employers do in their own workplaces, right, which is the largest first step of a community in most people's lives, they actually don't do a great job of creating a culture, right? When you ask most Americans, we survey close to 33,000 working Americans every week. we learned that the characteristics or the adjectives that they use to describe their cultures are retaliatory and separating, causing separation more often than not. So at the end of the day, employers start more often than not by building their own culture and being more conscious around that. And then the next practice that I see is really the value in building those types of programs, that public-private partnership, but at the level where you're focused on something other than your talent shortages, something other than I want to do something good for the community. Let's focus on exactly what our objective is, which is social cohesion.
Well, are there industries that are doing this better?
I'd argue there are some that are doing better, but surprisingly, it's the ones that you wouldn't expect. So when I look at this, I'm looking at our data, typically it's actually manufacturing. And I'm sort of stunned by the fact that it is manufacturing, because it tends to be a sort of an old world kind of industry. It's not the one we think of when it comes to really engaging in these types of activities. But manufacturing has one historical element in what they do, which is they build towns and they shut them down. And when you build and are invested in communities to that degree, you start to see that particular value. I'd actually encourage you all to learn specifically about an organization known as Barry Waymiller, which actually did this and repeated it over and over again in terms of building that social cohesion, not just in the workplace, but across communities throughout the Midwest.
Where are they based?
So they're based out of St. Louis, but also Phillips, Wisconsin.
Good thing to learn.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Sean, have you seen business leaders use your data to do the kind of changes that Alex just talked about?
Yeah, I think we've seen a number of state-based institutions use the index, which has been really encouraging. And I think one of the benefits of the index in a way is, I think being based in London, perhaps, we can come humbly with the index and we're not perhaps maybe considered either side of the aisle, as it were. And so there's an impartiality in a sense built within the index. And we've seen in Mississippi, for example, we did a presentation there with one of the think tanks around some of the challenges that Mississippi is facing. And one of them was around high levels of occupational licensing. And then not long after, and I'm not attributing causality here at all, but I think it was a helpful confirmatory factor in the decision making, because they were people from the legislature at the actual webinar. They adopted universal recognition for around 30 occupations, which then would be help create more of a dynamic environment within the state, so people could come in from other states without having to retrain. So that was just one example.
Thank you so much, Sean. We are short on time and a lot to discuss, and I don't want to close the panel without talking about mental health, because it's critically important. And Teal was sort of teased us in her answer in the beginning about what's happening in Montana. What I'd like to do is just sort of a round robin with the panelists and ask you to tell us from your perspective how the findings on mental health have impacted the work that you do. And perhaps what I'll do is just go down and start with Fred and ask you to comment on that.
Yeah, so, as we kind of swam through the first parts of COVID, we found that folks being cooped up alone by themselves was helping to push the numbers even further. And so we figured out how to group people together online. So we have folks connected from Chicago to Albuquerque to Idaho, all to talk about the work that they do in communities, how to support one another. And as we get out of COVID, eventually, I guess, we're figuring out how to help them take off screen and do the work in communities as a way to make sure they aren't inside. And so we see that picking up pretty big. We started with 800 people, and now we have 8,000 people connected online every single day, just because we were going to use some of the bigger groups, but we recognize that some of those social media sites are extractive. And so we created our own just to give a space. So.
Amazing. It's a huge jump. Teal, I'm looking at you on the screen as if you can see me, but I should go this way. Teal, would you mind, do you want to say anything else about the mental health?
All I was really going to say from a philanthropic side, we've just found funders that are really interested in figuring out how we can use philanthropy to support this. And one initiative that we are really launching, it's a fund, charitable fund we have that opened last year, but it's called the Montana Mental Health Access Fund. And seed funding actually came from AMB West Philanthropies, which has been a very important funder partner of ours. And, we have a committee of experts in mental health that are really looking at how can we use philanthropy to support innovative, maybe new approaches to mental health in Montana to better address it. So that's kind of what we're seeing in Montana from a philanthropic side.
I will share with you the most interesting stat from employer assistance programs, EAPs, in particular around mental health. Before the pandemic, the utilization rates were 4%. After the pandemic, 46%. 46%. Never before has that been the case. Never in any way. And what's most intriguing to me is actually the value that employers are seeing in mental health when it comes to their bottom line. More often than not, we're seeing them actually force mental health and engagement in caring about their own mental wellness of their workforces. So what I would tell you is there's true value in being creative about these kind of services and also in making them known to your employer community.
Huge statistic. Rosie.
I would say, when it comes to health and mental well-being, of course, it shot through the roof because we saw the large increases, not only in domestic violence, but we also saw it in child abuse as well. But what for us, we have what we call Thrive United 365. And it's a health initiative that basically says we will meet you where you are, no matter where you are, 365 days a year. While we, of course, were in COVID, to your point about having the trusted advisors of people who they would go to, be it faith partners and the like. We know in many of the African-American communities, the faith partners are trusted advisors as a part of that social cohesion. And then, of course, when we get to seeing who needs it the most and knowing how to meet people, sometimes we invested in online distance learning or telemedicine, if you will, for those kinds of services where they may have gotten teletherapy services and the like. And we continue with those. So we've seen that come up. It's not necessarily something new, but we've seen how we've had to come up with some innovative solutions during that crisis. And we think that some of the tools that have been born out of this crisis should continue. Just because we think we're going back to normal, I don't call it a new normal. I said we're going to a better normal, because at the end of the day, this is something that's going to be with us for the long haul.
I love that. A better normal. Generally we have time to stick to the things that I say we're going to do, but today I apologize to you because we went a little bit long. If you can stay, we can answer some of the questions, but we are at the hour. So I want to do a couple of things. The first, I really want to thank our panelists for spending time with us this morning and for sharing your insights. I urge you all to go to their respective homes and learn about the work that they do. They're extraordinary American leaders. I would also like to thank Sean, who is here from London, for an excellent presentation on the index. And we're going to have a website that will go live in the next couple of weeks that you can sort of dig into the data and learn. And finally, I would like to thank United Way again for hosting us here today. It's a beautiful facility and we're very lucky to be able to use it. So thank you. As we close, there are people here who made today happen. And I'd like to thank the team at the Milken Center for Advancing the American Dream for putting together this event. Thank all of you. And for those of you who can stay, there's still food at the reception. Thank you very much. Thank you all, and don't get quiet.
It's fine. Sweet Caroline. Right? No.
Thank you, Teal. Thank you, Teal. Thank you, Sean.
You hear any difference in the thoughts?